Long before the Imperium of Man spanned the stars, before the Legiones Astartes marched across the galaxy, the Emperor first had to conquer Terra. The world was fractured into countless warring techno-barbarian states that were armed with dangerous technologies and violent tendencies born from desperation. To unify the planet, the Emperor created the Thunder Warriors, superhuman soldiers bred for brutal, high-intensity combat. Their armor, the earliest form of power armor, would later be designated Mk I Thunder Armour. Eventually, the Adeptus Astartes replaced the Thunder Warriors and adopted the Thunder Armour for themselves. Note that during this time, this armor didn't have a designated model name. It was simply called Power Armor. The name and number came later, with the former being derived from the Imperium's Raptor Imperialis symbol, which had thunder and lightning bolts. This symbol represented the Emperor's armies before the more well-known Imperial Aquila became widespread in later centuries. The Thunder Armour may be a pioneering step for every other power armor type, but it was still a prototype in many ways. The design priorities were clear: raw strength, survivability, and the ability to overwhelm opponents in close-quarters conditions. What it did well, it did very well, and what it didn't do well are things the Inquisition won't allow us to talk about. The core characteristics of the Mk I armor include a powered upper body, where the torso and arms were the heart of the suit. Heavy plates, internal fibers, and power conduits amplified arm strength dramatically. This allows its user to smash barricades, wield oversized weapons, or overpower enemies through sheer force. In contrast, the legs weren't powered at all. Protection varied from padded trousers to basic metal greaves, depending on resources and manufacturer. It made for a somewhat unbalanced design: tremendously strong upper body, entirely normal running speed, a practical limitation, but one Astartes usually solved by simply walking through whatever stood in the way. Additionally, the suit wasn't airtight, nor did it contain environmental or life support systems. It was designed for the battlefields of Terra, not alien environments or the harshness of space. The Thunder Armour was also widely used by non-Space Marine combatants. Other than the Thunder Warriors, many of the techno-barbarians they fought also fielded this armor pattern, hoping to defeat the Emperor's armies using their own tech. While crude compared to later marks, Thunder Armour established the fundamental concepts: an integrated backpack power supply, strength-enhancing fibers, servo-assisted movement, and the philosophy of turning a superhuman fighter into a one-man siege engine. It was a transition point between traditional armor and the fully mechanized exoskeletons that would define the Legiones Astartes during the Great Crusade and beyond. As Terra was finally unified and the Space Marine legions rose to prominence, the limitations of the Mk I became apparent. It wasn't suited for long campaigns, and certainly not for warfare beyond Earth. To meet the demands of humanity's first interstellar expansion, a new design was needed. One that would become the first fully sealed, fully powered battlesuit, the Mk II Crusade Armour. The Mk II, dubbed the Crusade Armour, was the first fully enclosed, fully powered suit issued to the newly created Space Marine legions after the conquest of Terra. Unlike the more primitive upper-body-focused suits of the early days, Crusade Armour offered a complete package. The torso, arms, and legs were powered. The suit was sealed, and it included life support systems, enabling Marines to fight in toxic atmospheres, on alien worlds, or even in the vacuum of space. The Mk II used microscopic rings of ceramite to form armor plates. This design granted better mobility compared to the older, more rigid Thunder pattern. On the Crusade armor, power conduits were threaded inside the plating, making them less exposed. More efficient cooling systems allowed the power coils on the chest to also be kept inside the armor now. The helmet included thought-activated communications, targeting reticules, visual overlays, and enhanced vision modes such as infrared and ultraviolet and low-light modes, making the wearer far deadlier than a standard human soldier under an old visor. All told, the Mk II was the first modern leap forward, a real, war-ready suit capable of dealing with the wide variety of environments a galaxy-spanning army would encounter. Of course, it still wasn't perfect. The Mk II had its own flaws. Because of the complex ringed plating, articulated joints, and internal systems, the Crusade armor was notoriously difficult and time-consuming to repair and maintain. Many later patterns abandoned some of the complexity for ease of maintenance. Another downside was that while the upper body power cabling was mostly internalized, the new powered leg sections couldn't fully integrate the new torso's cooling design. As a result, some cables remained exposed at the back of the lower legs, not ideal for when a Marine gets surrounded or ambushed from behind. And during this era, the helmet was sealed to the gorget, the chest piece, meaning the head couldn't turn independently. The Marine had to swivel the whole torso, like a character in a game with tank controls. Lastly, though the Mark II may be quieter and more mobile than the Mark I, it's still relatively bulky, loud, and primarily built for frontal assaults and heavy combat, not infiltration or covert ops. Despite all the downsides, the Mark II Crusade armor is often regarded as the first real power armor, the suit that allowed humanity's most elite soldiers to become truly interstellar warriors. They're called Space Marines after all, so it would make sense that they have suits that allow them to fight in space. During the early days of the Imperium's expansion, the Grand Crusade, the armor gave the Legiones Astartes the flexibility to fight in wildly varied conditions, from toxic worlds to the vacuum of the void, from dusty wastelands to alien jungles. It boasted strength enhancement, environmental protection, and increased battlefield awareness, setting the standard for all future marks. However, as centuries passed and technological resources, or the lack thereof, forced streamlining, the complexity and maintenance burden made Crusade armor less practical for mass deployment. By the 42nd millennium, it had largely fallen out of regular use, though in some chapters, a few suits remain as revered relics. In lore and fan memory alike, the Mark II stands as a milestone, the transition from brutal, terror-bound armor to the fully realized, galaxy-spanning power suits that define the Space Marines. It's a symbol of ambition, of humanity reaching out into the stars, and of the price of maintaining said ambition. As the Great Crusade pushed farther from terror and deeper into hostile territory, the Imperium encountered civilizations capable of fielding increasingly powerful weaponry. The early Crusade armor, while revolutionary, was designed with mobility and versatility in mind, but certain battlefields demanded something else: the ability to march straight into brutal, high-intensity frontal engagements without being torn apart. This is where Mark III iron armor emerged. Now admittedly, the Mark III wasn't designed to replace the existing Mark II suits across the legions. Instead, it was an alternative, specialized armor pattern intended for ship-to-ship boarding actions, tunnel fighting, and situations where charging the enemy head-on wasn't just possible, it was expected. In those environments, mobility mattered far less than durability. For reference, this is the armor you'd pick if someone told you the mission briefing included the phrase point-blank plasma fire. Think of the Mark III as an alternate Crusade pattern armor rather than a straight upgrade. The most obvious change from the Mark II is the specifically reinforced front plate design. The chest, helmet, and shoulder pauldrons all received additional layers of armor plating. The front-facing sections were built to absorb the brunt of incoming fire, especially when advancing down confined corridors. The helmet featured sloping plates, which offered improved protection by deflecting shots to the left and right. The limbs also received localized reinforcement, though the bulk of extra protection stayed concentrated on the front of the suit. The rear remained comparatively lighter, partly to save weight, and partly because Mark III users weren't exactly expected to turn around much. Some joke that the iron armor was designed for no-nonsense Marines who have zero interest in retreating, and honestly, the design philosophy backs that up. However, the iron armor wasn't without its drawbacks. As mentioned, the additional plating made it heavier, limiting agility. The overlapping segments and reinforced front added mechanical complexity, increasing maintenance time. It also retained some exposed power cabling on the rear legs, a holdover from the Mark II's design limitations. Despite these flaws, the Mark III quickly became a valued tool across many legions. Units specializing in breaching, shock assault, or void operations often fielded considerable numbers of iron armor suits. Where other armor faltered under concentrated fire, the Mark III allowed a Marine to keep pushing forward, step by determined step. Ultimately, iron armor represented a practical response to battlefield realities. When mobility couldn't save you, overwhelming armor plating would. As the Great Crusade accelerated, so too did the Imperium's advancements in technology. The Mechanicum, with access to newly rediscovered forges and STCs, sought to design a more refined, more efficient suit of power armor to succeed the complex Mark II and the highly specialized Mark III. The result was the Mark IV Maximus armor, a major technological leap that aimed to create the most efficient and maintainable armor the Imperium had ever fielded. Mark IV's development centered on three goals: simplified maintenance and enhanced battlefield performance, while maintaining the level of protection provided by previous models. One of its most distinctive design improvements was the improved armoring of its power cables. This allowed it to safely place some of the cables in the exterior of the armor, without the risk of them being damaged or destroyed. The armor's plating was also refined. While not as heavily reinforced as the Mark III's frontal bulk, new technologies discovered by the Mechanicum allowed them to make the design lighter, while also making it easier to manufacture and maintain. Its silhouette became sleeker and more streamlined, making the wearer both more mobile and easier to maintain. The overlapping rings and hoops of the Mark II were replaced with broader, cleaner plates that fitted together more efficiently with flexible joints. The helmet also received a notable overhaul. Visually, they had a narrower, more angular faceplate, a design that would heavily influence the look of some of the later armor patterns. The biggest change, though, might be the fact that the helmet is no longer attached to the neck plates, allowing the head and the body to turn separately, while still being completely sealed from the elements. The Mark IV is the moment where power armor started to resemble the iconic modern Astartes image. While the Mark II was reliable but extremely labor-intensive to maintain, and the Mark III was sturdy but lacked mobility, the Mark IV focused on accessibility for tech marines and armorers. This was back when the Imperium still tried creating things that are easier to maintain, something almost unheard of in the 42nd millennium. Initially, the Mark IV was meant to be the peak of Astartes' power armor, the suit that should have allowed the Emperor's armies to finally retake all of humanity's lost worlds. It protected the Space Marines from all known threats at the time. What could go wrong? The outbreak of the Horus Heresy cut off supply lines and shattered the Mechanicum's ability to produce the suit in large numbers. And of course, before those supply lines were cut, the War Master, Horus Lupercal, already had the chance to arm the traitor legions with the sparkly new Maximus armors. In contrast, many loyalist legions only received partial shipments before civil war disrupted everything. As a result, the Mark IV became a symbol not only of technological progress, but also of the beginning of the stagnation of said progress. Still, many suits endured. Some legions maintained, modified or repurposed them for centuries. Even in the 42nd millennium, fragments and relics of the Mark IV persist, often treasured by chapters that trace their origins back to Crusade-era forces. The Maximus armor stands as one of the great, if only, designs of Imperial history. Had the Horus Heresy not erupted, the Imperium might have standardized future armor based on the Mark IV's principles. Instead, history had other plans, and power armor's evolution took a very different path. As mentioned previously, when the galaxy erupted in civil war, the loyalist Space Marine legions had limited access to the Mark IV Maximus armor, thanks to Horus rediverting supplies to legions he thought or knew would turn. As the war progressed, many loyalist units found themselves cut off from supply lines, their armor battered and irreplaceable. Into that chaos stepped the Mark V Heresy armor, a gritty, make-do pattern designed for one purpose: to keep fighting when nothing else was available. Unlike previous armor patterns that were created because innovation made their predecessors obsolete, the Heresy armor was born out of necessity, a stopgap design that could be built from recovered or even scrapped materials, patched together quickly, and maintained under the worst conditions. Many examples you'll see of the Mark V use distinctive molecular bonding studs to hold together layers of plasteel and ceramite, a telltale sign of its improvisational craftsmanship. These studs often appear on the helmet, left shoulder plate, and lower legs. The additional layers also made the armor more effective against bolter fire, something previous armors weren't designed for. The very thought of the Emperor's angels fighting to kill each other was practically unimaginable before the Heresy. Heresy armor wasn't meant to rival the high-end standards of the Mark IV. Instead, it prioritized ease of manufacture, quick repairs, and functionality under fire. In many cases, suits were repaired with scavenged armor plates, leftover components, and stripped-down systems. Anything that worked was good enough. Some of the helmet designs were described as bulldog-like or rugged, supposedly based loosely on earlier power armor helmets. These were, in fact, a version of the helmets of tactical dreadnought armors, aka Terminators, that were specifically retrofitted to the size of regular Astartes power armor. These weren't as sophisticated as the Mark IV helmets, but like most of the Mark V, it was better than nothing. Because of the use of lower-grade materials and the hasty assembly, some performance drawbacks emerged. In particular, Heresy armor reportedly suffered from a tendency to overheat quickly, a side effect of simpler cooling and power routing systems. To compensate, many wearers had to throttle down their backpack power output in long engagements to avoid overheating. Given its patchwork nature, Mark V was always a temporary solution. Once the Heresy ended and legions reorganized or reformed, many suits were dismantled and cannibalized for spare parts, often used to repair real armor patterns. For some Loyalist chapters, these rough sets even brought back unwanted memories of humanity at its weakness. The traitor legions, however, harbored no such negative feelings for the Mark V, which is why it still sees relative widespread use among them. The armor's association with the traitor legions has grown so much that the Inquisition and some Loyalist forces might raise an eyebrow when seeing an Astartes suited in one. Despite its negative connotations, the Heresy armor remains a grim symbol of surviving the trial of fire, of Marines who kept fighting when resources and hope were all but gone. In that sense, the Mark V Heresy armor is a testament to the creativity, grit, and brutal stubbornness of humanity. Moving on from the scrappy pragmatism of Heresy-era improvisation, the next evolution in Space Marine armor was designed to bring back reliable quality and a touch of subtle style, and that's exactly what the Mark VI Corvus armor brings to the plate. First issued shortly before or during the early stages of the Horus Heresy, it rapidly became one of the most iconic and enduring armor patterns. Mark VI was designed as an official, refined replacement for the Mark IV, but crucially, one built with the realities of far-flung war in mind. The suit incorporated duplicate power cabling and maintenance systems. That means, even if one system failed, a backup could take over with minimal drop-off in performance. For tech Marines scrabbling parts from battlefields or salvage yards, this kind of redundancy was a godsend. There are multiple aesthetic and functional improvements that set the Mark VI apart. One of the most apparent ones is the helmet, which has a distinctive beak shape, a design that the Orcs and many fans affectionately call beaky armor. That faceplate was more than just for show. The beak housed improved auto-sense systems, which provided better vision, targeting overlays, and sensors, making the wearer's awareness much sharper. The exterior shell was redesigned for efficiency. Most power cables were routed under the ceramite plates, giving the armor cleaner lines and reducing exposed vulnerabilities. The left shoulder plate, a traditional weak point under fire, continued to use the molecular bonding studs commonly found on Mark V suits. This made replacement or field repairs faster and easier. Later Mark VI suits made the left shoulder plate match the quality of the right, but kept the bonding studs to honor the design that was in place when the Loyalists won the Heresy. The left shoulder plate might have been easier to repair or replace than most other parts, but the Corvus armor in general was built for easy maintenance. Its more complex parts are backwards compatible with the simpler and more common parts found in older designs. Overall, the Mark VI was lighter than many previous Marks, while still offering solid protection, a balance of mobility and defense. Many tech Marines consider it the smoothest moving early power armor Mark, thanks to refined joint design and updated servo systems. The suit was first deployed among the legions just as the Heresy erupted. The first recipients were the Raven Guard, which was the legion assigned to field test it, a fitting choice given the new armor's suitability for stealth and high mobility engagements. Not to mention, the new helmet's beaked visage gave them a bird of prey aesthetic that matched their legion's namesake and style. All of this led to the Mark VI receiving the Corvus moniker in honor of the Raven Guard's Primarch, Corvus Corax. As the war spread and supply lines fractured, the ease of maintenance and part interchangeability made the Corvus armor increasingly sought after, not just among specialized units, but many regular fighting companies. By the time of the Siege of Terra, The Corvus armor was among the most common armor patterns you could find. Both the Loyalist and traitor forces fielded the Mk VI en masse. While some chapters later moved on to newer marks, the legacy of Corvus armor endured. Its design philosophy, modularity and blend of protection and mobility makes it an iconic pattern that still finds use in the present era of 40k. If the Mk V was the duct tape armor that kept Marines alive long enough to patch up their bolters, the Mk VI was a production quality suit that they could depend on for more complex engagements. In short, Mk VI made power armor not just functional, but dependable once more, a milestone in turning war gear into legend. Mk VII Aquila armor is arguably the most iconic pattern of Space Marine armor ever produced. So iconic, in fact, that if someone says Space Marine, odds are they're picturing this suit, whether they know it or not. Developed during the closing years of the Horus Heresy, the Mk VII pattern represented the Imperium's attempt to standardize production while preserving the strongest aspects of earlier designs. In many ways, it became the culmination of everything learned during decades of brutal warfare. The most defining feature of Mk VII is the armored breastplate adorned with the Imperial Aquila, or the winged skull Imperialis. This wasn't just stylistic. The reinforced chest plating was designed to improve protection over the heart and primary power conduits. Earlier marks had experimented with cable routing and varied plate arrangements, but Aquila armor consolidated these lessons into a more unified, durable design. The entire torso assembly became more resilient, and the exposed chest cabling, which was the main weakness of the Mk VI, was finally sealed away behind a symbol of allegiance to the Emperor. The helmet also saw refinement. Visually, the Mk VII helmet bridges a transition between the beaked Mk VI variant and more modern patterns, flattening the muzzle into something angular and distinctly martial. The helmet made the Astartes look even more brutal, if you could imagine that, without sacrificing the sensor capabilities of the Corvus armor. The tech priests found a way to make do with the beak design and compartmentalize all the additional sensors in a smaller helmet. If the Mk VI helmet was the stylish pre-heresy bird of prey look, the Mk VII helmet features a brutal, cold, and untrusting look born from betrayal. As the Aquila armor is a direct upgrade of the Corvus armor, flexibility and mobility were also far better than the loud, clunky predecessors. During the Siege of Terra and the scouring that followed, the Mk VII saw extensive deployment among Loyalist forces. In many cases, suits were rushed straight from Forge World assembly lines to the front. Even after the heresy and the formation of the Codex Astartes, the armor remained a staple pattern across the galaxy. Its iconic design, reliability, easily replaceable components, and robust structure ensured that it persisted all the way into the 41st millennium, still worn by thousands upon thousands of Space Marines. In short, Mk VII Aquila armor became the face of the Imperium's Angels of Death, dependable, recognizable, and built to survive whatever the galaxy threw at it, which was usually something unpleasant and on fire. Think of it as the classic model Space Marine suit, the one that stuck around because it simply worked, and definitely not because the Imperium stopped innovating and inventing. The Mk VIII Errant armor represents an attempt to refine the already successful Mk VII design, pushing it toward a new standard that, unfortunately, never became fully widespread. Introduced during the 41st millennium, this armor pattern is generally considered to only be a slight upgrade to the Mk VII. The changes from the Mk VII to the VIII are not as radical as compared to past transitions, such as the switch from the Mk IV to V or the Mk V to VI. While not hugely different, Errant armor introduced some noteworthy structural and protective enhancements. The most distinctive improvement of the Mk VIII is the reinforced gorget, essentially the armored collar surrounding the helmet mount. Earlier armor patterns sometimes left a small vulnerability between the chest and helmet, where a lucky strike could slip through. Errant armor addressed this concern with a raised, thickened collar that overlapped the lower rim of the helmet. This protected the neck area from decapitation strikes from blades, shrapnel, or the occasional tyrannid bioorganism. It was one of those changes that made every tech marine wonder why it hadn't been added earlier. Another advancement was the redesigned chest plate, which further emphasized protection over critical systems. Power cables and conduits were hidden even more thoroughly than in the Mk VII, leaving the breastplate smoother and more solid, other than the raised Imperial Aquila or Imperialis, of course. Despite these advancements, Mk VIII never became the dominant armor pattern its designers envisioned. As with most things in the modern Imperium, production started slow. The errant armor saw limited deployment and so was only reserved for veteran Astartes. It was intended to eventually replace the Mk VII, even though the process would probably take several centuries, or maybe even millennia. But with the arrival of the Primaris Space Marines and their new Mk X armor, there's now even less reason to mass-produce the Mk VIII. Still, those who wore the full Mk VIII appreciated its thoughtful refinements and increased survivability. It was the armor equivalent of a well-tuned classic car with new safety features. Familiar, reliable, and improved where it counted, even if it never quite had its moment in the spotlight. The official explanation for the missing Mk IX armor is, well, there isn't one. In classic Imperium fashion, it's either lost in a vault, misfiled under M for maybe later, or sitting in a Mechanicus storage crate someone forgot to open for 9,000 years. The general consensus is that Games Workshop just skipped the 9 numbering because 10 just sounded cooler. And in Warhammer 40k, the rule of cool always wins out. Another reason might be that it has something to do with a certain fickle god of change who likes the number 9. Whatever the reason, no one knows, so we'll just move on to the Mk X. The Mk X Primaris armor represents one of the most significant leaps in power armor technology since the earliest days of the Imperium, created as part of Archmagos Belisarius Kul's centuries-long project. Under secret commission from Rabute Guilliman, this armor was engineered specifically for the newly crafted Primaris Space Marines. It blends principles from earlier armor patterns while incorporating entirely new systems, forming a suit that is sturdier, more efficient, and more versatile than its predecessors. At first glance, the Mk X design looks like an evolutionary mix of classic power armor aesthetics. It features a helmet that's visually similar to the Mk IV Maximus helmet and a torso that resembles the Mk VII and VIII suits. It has the broad silhouette familiar to any Space Marine, but the proportions are sharper and more anatomically streamlined. Instead of the bulkier plates seen on certain older patterns, the armor features clean angles, tight-fitting joints, and efficient layering. This gives Primaris Marines a distinct presence, imposing like their firstborn counterparts, yet cleaner and smoother in appearance. It's the difference between an old trusty battle tank and a new cutting-edge experimental tank design, both intimidating but in slightly different flavors. Modularity is where the Mk X truly shines. It has multiple variants and sub-variants that suit various Space Marine roles in combat. For example, the Mk X Tacticus variant is best suited for Intercessor and Desolation squads, while Heavy Intercessors and Inceptors would prefer the bulkier Mk X Gravis variant, which comes with its own jump pack. These variants all operate on the same underlying Mk X framework, so if a warrior ever feels the need to switch roles, they don't have to get an entirely new suit. They can just detach and slap on some new parts to switch variants. This versatility mirrors the Codex Astartes while also giving chapters the flexibility to tailor Primaris forces to their doctrines without juggling wildly different armor patterns. In the end, Mk X Primaris armor represents a new chapter in Imperial warfare. It combines the durability of earlier designs with technological innovations that the Imperium hasn't seen in 10,000 years. And in typical 40k fashion, it arrives just in time for a galaxy that has somehow become even more dangerous than before. Whether you see it as a masterpiece of design or evidence that Call had too much time on his hands, Mk X is power armor pushed to its modern extreme. From the clattering plates of the Mk I Thunder Armour all the way to the sleek and formidable Mk X Primaris, Space Marine power armor has evolved to accommodate the Imperium's endless wars. Each generation reflects its era, the improvisation of the heresy, the standardization of the Great Scouring, the long stagnation of the 41st millennium, and finally, the technological renaissance brought about, whether wisely or unwisely, by Belisarius Kul. Across 10 millennia, one thing has remained constant. Every suit is a fusion of engineering, faith, and brutal practicality, worn by warriors whose entire existence revolves around battle in humanity's name. But even with all the marks covered so far, we've only scratched the surface of what the Adeptus Astartes wear into combat. Beyond the standard patterns adopted by most chapters, like the truly specialized suits, armor's designed not for whole legions, but for particular chapters. gifted individuals, or extremely niche battlefield roles. These power armors don't quite fit into the Mark 1 to 10 lineage, but they're too iconic and too cool to ignore. The runic armor of the Space Wolves, for instance, is layered with protective wards carved by rune priests, giving its wearer a supernatural resilience that blends Fenrisian mysticism with Imperial craftsmanship. Similarly, the Aegis armor of the Grey Knights integrates psychic dampening systems and sacred inscriptions, turning the suit itself into a weapon against demonic influence. And, of course, we cannot forget Terminator armor, the tactical dreadnought suit that trades subtlety for the ability to walk through a wall, a plasma blast, or hordes of enemies, depending on the model. If the standard power armor is a knight's suit, Terminator armor is the siege engine version. And then there are the power armor types that are worn by non-Astartes forces, like the Adeptus Astartes, the Adeptus Custodes, and even some members of the Inquisition. The story of power armor evolution is vast, and there's a lot more to explore. Maybe that's exactly what we'll explore in a future video. After all, the Imperium never runs out of new wars, and it certainly never runs out of new armor to fight them in.